Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Safranski, and welcome to the Bible and the Eucharist. Today I'm going to be talking about the Last Supper. If the story of the Eucharist in the Bible, if you mapped it onto sort of the classic plot shape, right, this classic literary structure where the story has a period of rising action, a climax, and then a resolution, this would be the climax. The next few weeks, we'll be talking about John, which is also the part of the climax, but then some more early church stuff, St. Paul and Revelation. This is like where all those plans that God has been laying come to a head. So today, I'm going to be talking about the Last Supper, specifically in the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have their own account of the Last Supper. And like most things that are in those three Gospels, the stories are very similar, but with certain individual details that give them their own character. So the version I'm going to talk about mostly in this video is the version that is in Mark. And the reason for that is partially because Mark is the simplest. It's kind of the most bare bones version of the Last Supper, just like Mark is for most of the stories that he tells. I'll raise a couple of details from Luke, but of course, to get the full effect of the Last Supper stories, you should read all three of them in Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22. Now I'm focusing in on this, on the Last Supper, especially because I want you to see the connections between all of the Old Testament themes we've talked about and this absolutely central event, right? As Christians, when we look back to find the Eucharist in the Bible, or when we think about the origins of the Eucharist, surely the Last Supper is where we go. And I think what's important for us is to become more aware of the fact that at the Eucharist, Jesus and the apostles, they were also looking backward. They were also seeing and feeling and reflecting on Israel's history and how it was coming to a climax at that supper. Okay? So the first thing I want to do is talk just a minute about the chronology of the Last Supper. Actually, I want to ask a question about the day that the Last Supper is celebrated on. So as you probably already know, and as I'm going to talk about a lot, the Last Supper is essentially a Passover meal, right? Now, Passover for the Jews is a movable feast in terms of the days of the week. It's very much like the way we figure out Christmas, right? Christmas is always on the same day of the month, December 25th, but varies on the days of the week because our calendar of months does not match up exactly to our calendar of days within the week, right? So the question that the scriptures raise is, in the year Jesus died, when he was celebrating the Last Supper with his disciples, was Passover on a Friday or a Saturday? Now, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the last Passover is very clearly stated to be on a Friday. Now, what that means, in case you don't know this, the way the Jewish people understand days, they don't start at midnight and run to the following midnight like our days. They start at sundown and run to the following sundown. So the way Passover worked is that if we say that Passover is Friday, what that really means is that it goes from sundown on Thursday until sundown on Friday. Okay? And the Passover meal would actually be celebrated that first evening. All right? So if Passover's on a Friday, then the Passover meal, which included the eating of the sacrificed Passover lamb, would have happened on Thursday evening. All right? So for the synoptics, Passover is on Friday, so that we can say that the Last Supper meal was very, very definitively a Passover meal with the eating of the sacrificial lamb, which is Jesus, right? Now, John presents something a little bit different. According to the Gospel of John, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in that video, Passover that year was on a Saturday, which means that Friday evening would have been the first day or the first evening of Passover. And what that lets John do is he has Jesus dying on the cross at the same time the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. Right? It's a little bit, I know this is a little bit crazy, but right, we have this extremely strong tradition that Jesus was executed on a Friday. So if Passover is on Saturday, then the Passover lambs are being slaughtered at the temple on Friday afternoon at about 3 o'clock. Now, which day was Passover really that year? I'm not even going to try to answer that. Okay. Partially because scholars disagree about what year Jesus was actually put to death, and partially because that's not the point. The point is that in both of these gospel accounts of the Last Supper, Jesus' death is tied very explicitly to the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. Okay, it's just that John is more interested in Jesus dying when the Passover lambs die, and the synoptic writers are more interested in showing that the Last Supper was a true Passover meal. Okay? So enough about the chronology for now. What I want to do is talk about the story of the Last Supper. I said specifically as it's portrayed in Mark. And I'm going to show how it is definitely a Passover meal, and it is definitely a sacrificial meal. Now, I say definitely a sacrificial meal because that's a fairly distinct way that we as Catholics, as well as some other historical Christian churches, the Orthodox and Eastern Catholics as well as Western Catholics, etc., we tend to focus on the sacrificial character of the Eucharist, while your kind of historical Protestant congregations tend to downplay the sacrificial aspect of the meal and play up the aspect of it as a community meal or just kind of a commemoration, right? And that distinction is very important for lots of theological reasons. But for our purposes, it's most important because you always eat the sacrifice. And so if we can see that the Last Supper is definitely a sacrificial meal, then logically it follows that we have to eat the sacrificial victim in order to be included in the covenant that's being made. All right, so Passover and sacrificial. To start off with, I'm going to read just a few verses from Mark's account. This is in Mark chapter 14, verses 22 to 24. And these words should sound familiar. Quote, And as they were eating, he took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Unquote. Okay, so it's a short passage, but there's so much going on here. Now, first of all, you just have to go back to Mark, that same chapter, 14, verse 12, to see that the gospel author wants us to understand that this is being done at the same time as, or in the place of, this is being performed as a traditional Passover meal, right? On part of our text that gives us, a very quick clue into the form of the meal that makes it a Passover meal is that fourfold structure of the sacred meal that I discussed when I was talking about the multiplication of the loaves, right? Take, bless, break, and give. In verse 22, Jesus very clearly does those four things with the bread, showing that this is a sacred ritual meal. So given that it is clearly being done as a Passover meal, the absence of a Passover lamb is a huge flashing neon sign. Okay? Yes, Passover meals for the ancient Israelites, when they had the temple and they were able to sacrifice lambs, Passover meals did have other aspects to them. They had bread, they had the bitter herbs, they had wine, special cups of wine that were all ritual parts of this. But the absolute heart of the Passover meal is the Korban Pesach, or the sacrificial lamb. Okay? The whole reason that Israelites would travel to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover was because Jerusalem at the temple was the only place you could sacrifice an animal. And to celebrate Passover properly, you had to sacrifice a lamb. So the absence of a lamb, in the sense of, right, the fluffy white animal or whatever, the actual livestock animal, the absence of that lamb is a giant flashing sign that says Jesus is the lamb. Okay, he is the one to be sacrificed. Right? Now here I'm going to bring up a detail from Luke as well. Luke chapter 22, verse 19, Jesus tells his disciples, after he speaks these words, "Do this in remembrance of me." In other words, he tells the disciples to take the way he is celebrating Passover and to carry it forward. This is one of the tricky things as Christians, is that God said in the book of Exodus that Passover was to be a perpetual institution, that the Jewish people were never to stop celebrating Passover. So the fact that Jesus includes this admonition to continue performing this meal this way is a hint to the fact that this is Passover, that he is making it new, that he is fulfilling it, and that the perpetual institution still stands. All right? So one of the last things I want to talk about is the fact that the Last Supper is a covenant ratification ceremony, just like the original Passover meal. Okay? If you remember back to the aspects of covenant, they included a variety of things. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of those things later. But one thing that's very important for a covenant ratification ceremony is a sacrifice. A real ratification needs real sacrifice, and if you want to be part of that covenant, you really have to eat the sacrifice. In other words, for the Last Supper to stand as ratification of the new covenant between God and humanity, there can't be any pretend eating. You can't symbolically eat the animal. At Passover in the Old Testament, as they renewed and ratified the covenant between themselves and God, they were commanded to eat the flesh of the lamb. And in fact, to eat all of it, right? You cannot pretend to eat the ratification sacrifice. Okay. So let's talk about some of the reasons that we should understand the Last Supper as a sacrificial meal. So first, we've already established that this is a Passover meal, a real Passover meal, then it is automatically sacrificial because the Passover was established and continued perpetually as a sacrificial meal, right? It also contains, just in these few verses, the account of the Last Supper contains really all or nearly all of the themes that we talked about were important to the whole concept of sacrifice for the Old Testament, for the Jewish people, for ancient people in general, that we talked about way back in the start of this video series. So, sort of first of all, and almost most fundamentally, sacrifice is about thanksgiving. And the theme of thanksgiving is obviously very present in these verses. The word Eucharist that we use in English comes from the Greek Eucharistein, which means to give thanks. So our whole name for this ceremony, for this ritual, comes from the word to give thanks. And it says explicitly in the text that Jesus takes the cup and gives thanks to the Father. All right, so thanksgiving is present in sacrifice. Substitution is also an important aspect of sacrifice. If we remember back to the redemption of the firstborn in Exodus, there was a very strong sense that when we offer a sacrifice, at least certain sacrifices, that we are offering them in place of ourselves, that we're saying, God, you possess us, our lives belong to you. And so in thanksgiving or in substitution for my own death, a death which I deserve and a death which you could give me at any moment if you wanted to, we offer this animal instead. Jesus tells us that he is the animal being substituted for us when he talks about his blood being shed for many. Right? So then let's talk about covenant and the aspects of the Last Supper that tie back to everything we've discussed about covenant. Well, the first and most obvious part of this passage that points to covenant is the word covenant that is in the phrase, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." We talked about this. We look back to Exodus chapter 24, when the people of Israel were accepting the Mosaic law, were agreeing to live under the Mosaic law. In other words, they were agreeing to live in a specific kind of relationship with God as part of his family, following his rules, right? And they were covered with the blood of the sacrificial animals as a way of tying them very visibly, very viscerally, very sort of undeniably tying them to the covenant which was being made. Right? So by referring to this as the blood of the covenant, Jesus is telling the people who are receiving it, right, who are drinking that blood, that through this sacrifice and by being physically tied in with this sacrifice, they are entering into the new and, in a sense, the final earthly stage of God's relationship with humanity. Okay? So the question, should come up for us, especially for those of us who aren't as familiar with the Old Testament as we could be. What is the covenant that Jesus is initiating? What is the covenant that we are entering into by receiving his blood when we attend the Eucharist? In the Old Testament, it was often more clear, right? The terms of the covenant. In the Old Testament texts, it often said, God would say, I am entering into a covenant with you. You will be my children and I will be your father. You will do this, I will do this. Now let's sacrifice, right? A lot of the time, those covenants in the Old Testament were much more clear. We don't have that kind of explicitly laid out text in the New Testament. But what we do have is the story of what Jesus came to do in his life, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, his sending the Spirit to be with the Christian community. Everything that the covenants, the Old Testament covenants, have been trying to do is made full and complete and, in a sense, unchangeable by Jesus through his life, his death, and his resurrection. What have all those covenants been trying to do? Well, those covenants have been uniting human beings with God, right, in a special familial relationship, a relationship of adoption as firstborn sons, as heirs. So establishing human beings in this relationship with God by making promises for them, and in turn giving them rules, ways to live, telling them, if you live this way, then you'll maintain a good relationship with me, with God, right? And you'll also maintain good relationships with each other, and you'll be able to be a blessing to the people of the world who don't know me, right? So Jesus has, in his life, death, and resurrection, has created a relationship between God and humanity that cannot be superseded, that can't be made better. And he did that by completely uniting himself with human nature. That's one way. He literally came down into our condition. He didn't just give us changing rules to adapt to our conditions. He didn't make us new promises based on what is happening to us, historically. He united himself with human nature, which, according to the letters of Peter, right, makes us partakers in the divine nature. Right? He's created a relationship that can't be made any better, can't be made any more intimate than that. All right? Now, Christ has also given us the complete and perfect law. He has given us the law that makes all of the laws before it doesn't do away with them, as he says in the Gospel of Matthew. It fulfills and completes them. This is the law of love, right? He tells us that if we truly love God and neighbor, and we act like it, then we are doing everything those previous laws were intended to bring about, right? then we will be living in that good relationship with him and with each other that he has always been trying to give us. Okay? And the trick to that is that he actually gives us the power to fulfill that law. One of the problems, and maybe saying problems isn't the right word, but one of the ways in which the old laws were incomplete was that with all their rules and regulations, we never gained the power to overcome our sinful nature and really fulfill what those laws were shooting at. So when the Old Testament, when the Mosaic Law tells us that if a man who is not set aside as a priest approaches Mount Sinai and steps on its slopes, then he's to be stoned to death. The point of that law is to encourage the proper reverence and love for God. When it tells us that if through your negligence one of your neighbor's animals comes to harm, you have to replace the animal, essentially, for your neighbor. That law isn't really, in the end, about animals. In the end, it's about loving your neighbor. But while those laws could kind of regulate our behaviors if we stuck to them, they didn't have the power to actually make us have the love and reverence for God and live in love and service of our neighbor that they were intended to do. But when Christ returns to the Father and sends the Spirit to us, we're going to actually have the power to fulfill the law of love, even though we don't always choose to do it perfectly, of course. Right? So this sacrifice that Christ makes to ratify this covenant is a complete and perfect one, right? Which makes more additional sacrifices unnecessary. This is why Jesus speaks of his blood as the blood of the covenant. This is why we read about the new covenant in Christ's blood, the final covenant that God will make with his people, because he literally couldn't make a better one, right? There's kind of I was thinking about this, and I thought about cars, okay? Think about like how you, let's say for years and years, because you don't have a lot of money, you're driving beaters, right? You're driving kind of secondhand cars. You have a car, a $500 Honda or whatever. The only purpose of it is to get you to work and back, or to, you can toss a suitcase in the trunk and it can get you to the airport, or it can get you to your, back to your parents' house, or whatever it is. You've got this beater, right? Then, by hard work, you become more prosperous, and you get the car that is essentially perfect for you. It's brand new. It's extremely dependable. Maybe it tows a trailer that you want to tow. It's super comfortable. It's fast, but not too fast. Once you've got that car, like, do you buy another beater after that? Well, no, of course. And the reason is because there's nothing the beater could do that your new car can't do better. Now, that doesn't mean the beaters you had before were useless, right? What it means is that the goal you've been shooting for, the purposes you've had for owning a car, have kind of been completed in this new vehicle, right? For me, this theoretical vehicle is actually two. I dream one more practical, one less practical. I dream of having a brand new Honda Ridgeline. I also dream of having a Porsche 911, not a brand new one, a little bit older one. Anyways, so lastly, in terms of covenant, let's come back to that original set of promises that we talked about God making to his chosen people in Genesis 12, right? What were those three promises, those three things that God promised he would give to his people that they were always looking for. The land, right? The nation or the descendants, that they would have many, that they would be a great nation, and that they would be a blessing to the nations, that everyone who came to them, everyone who saw them, who contacted them, would encounter God, right? By fulfilling all of the covenants and by sending his disciples out to continuously perform this, to continuously represent the ultimate sacrifice that Christ makes on the cross and that he offers on the altar of the Eucharist, by sending his disciples out, God is fulfilling that last promise in Genesis 12, the promise of the blessing. Remember back to the multiplication. There's 7 baskets left over. There is plenty Eucharist to go around. There's plenty for everyone. You guys, the disciples, are going to take this fulfillment of the relationship, fulfillment of the covenant. You're going to take it all over the world and offer it to every single person, right? God never said that every person in the world was going to accept the blessing or was going to choose to enter into the covenant, at least not until the end of days, when his full glory is revealed, but he did say that it would go out to all nations and peoples. So in tying all of these things back, all these parts of the Last Supper, all these aspects of it, back to these themes in the Old Testament, the question is, was the Eucharist something that the Jewish people could have expected or should have expected? And this goes back to one of my original reasons for doing this whole series, because I think that we as Christians and as Catholics tend to think about the Eucharist and don't really think about the history of it any farther back than the Last Supper. So when we realize how tied this all is to the Old Testament story, the story of salvation history, the question is, should or could the Jews have expected this? And the answer is yes and no. The ultimate answer is the same as the question of whether the Jews could or should have expected a Messiah that looked like Jesus, right? They were expecting things, but not necessarily in exactly the way that God ended up presenting them. So, for example, from long, long ago, the Jews were constantly sacrificing animals and grain and wine because God told them to, and they knew it was a good thing to do, and they did it for various purposes: Thanksgiving, reparation, adoration, all that stuff. So they continued doing that, but they also always knew that those sacrifices did not really fix the problems, right? They knew all along that a sin offering did not automatically give you a good heart, right? That killing an animal and dumping its blood out and burning its thigh and fat portions did not change your heart so that you would make different choices the next time, right? So in some sense, they expected the regime of sacrifice to change. Now, maybe in the end times, or maybe through some kind of more earthly process, an earthly Messiah, right? But they knew that their sacrifices were not really fixing the problem, okay? They also knew, looking back on their history, that God had always been not just establishing new covenants, but renewing and in a kind of updating the covenant, updating his relationship with them and with humanity, which kind of did cause them to sort of look forward and say, there's got to be a point where this is going to come to completion. There's going to have to be a point of ultimate fulfillment, right? These same sacrifices, ratifying this constantly updating covenant cannot go on forever. So they were looking for ultimate fulfillment of the covenant. But for the most part, probably not in the way that Jesus does it, right? They were, despite the fact that we look back on the suffering servant songs from Isaiah that we read every Holy Week, that talk about the suffering servant whose punishments caused us to be healed, the Jews mostly did not look for a Messiah who was going to fulfill the covenant by sacrificing himself. Okay, so that is an unexpected part of this. And lastly, Passover, again, for the most part, the Jews did not expect, and in a way, maybe they couldn't have expected exactly what was going to happen. Passover was said by God to be a perpetual institution. He told them, you're going to do this forever, right? Despite that, they knew that the covenant would eventually come to fulfillment. They knew that sacrifices would eventually end. So in some sense, they are looking for the fulfillment of Passover. And that's something that we as Christians can, are given the Spirit to look back on and to understand. But basically nobody expected the Messiah to fulfill the Passover by giving us his body to eat. However, that is exactly what he did. And we have so much reason to be thankful. I'm so thankful for this. That is all for this video. We could talk about the Last Supper forever. We'll talk about it just a little bit more next week when we talk about the Gospel of John. We're going to talk about a few of the really important Eucharistic episodes in the Gospel of John. And then after that, we're only 2 episodes from the end of this series. If you enjoyed this video, please do whatever you can to engage with it. Please like it, subscribe to my channel, hit the bell notification, share this, comment on it. If you like and comment, then more people will see it, and we can share this message with more people. Most importantly, pray for me. Go to the Eucharist, pray for me and the rest of God's people, and I will be praying for you at the Eucharist as well. Peace.